Okay, I just clicked the live button. As soon as I see that it comes through to YouTube properly, we will be rolling. There we go. Perfect. Hello and welcome. This is Michele Christensen of One Noteworthy Life, and today is stream number 17 in the GTD series. We are covering chapter 12 today, which is all about the power of the next action decision. So while we are getting rolling here, I invite you to type in any wins, any positive outcomes, any results you've had over the last few weeks as a result of using GTD. I'm going to put mine in, which is, and use the hashtag win. This week. So my win for the week is using my next action lists and contexts to make good decisions about what to do with small blocks of time. And what I mean by that is if I have 20 minutes before I have to start doing something or before I have to leave the house, I have been feeling really good about being able to make good use of those small, like odd blocks of time. So the chat box is open if you're joining us live. You can add questions, comments, thoughts, wins, whatever is related to this chapter in the chat box during the live chat. And if you're watching later, thank you for being here. And you can add your comments in the comments below this video. There's also super chats and super stickers available at the bottom of the chat box if you're watching live. So that's a way to financially support the channel and get your comment highlighted. And I do want to encourage you to add whatever's on your mind with respect to GTD, because it really helps to share our thoughts and to pool our knowledge. And that's one thing I'm really passionate about, is getting all of the collective knowledge out there gathered into one place so we can all benefit from it. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's do that. Yeah, that's good for now. So we are working from the updated 2015 version of GTD. The cover's on your screen right now. If you need a copy, there's an Amazon affiliate link in the description. And if you buy it through that, I get a small commission from Amazon that doesn't cost you anything. And this chapter is number 12. It's all about the power of the next action decision. And as with the previous chapter, number 11, that was on the power of the capture habit. I expected the benefits of this to be simple, and it looks like my mic might have been muted, so hopefully the sound's coming through okay. If it's not, let me know in the chat and I will go back and cover whatever was missed. If it was muted and you're watching on replay, we're just getting started. So yeah, with this chapter, which is chapter 12, and it's all about the power of the next action decision, I kind of expected this to be like very superficial, and it was actually really deep. And I had the same experience with chapter 11, which was about the power of the capture habit. And I expected that to be kind of superficial, and I was actually pleasantly surprised at how deep the knowledge goes. So I'm going to go into, it's very helpful to start with an outline. So that's on the screen right now. So in this chapter, we have an introduction. We have some discussion about where the technique came from and some ideas about procrastination and how to intelligently dumb down things you're stuck on. And then the final section is all about the value of the next action decision as a decision-making standard. So let me go ahead and I will check the chat here. Okay, so our first section is the introduction. So in this section, David Allen talks about how his personal mission is to include what's the next action in every interaction. And nothing, whether it's a casual conversation, a social conversation, a business conversation, a meeting, no interaction should end without everybody being clear on what the next actions are and who's going to do them. And I've mentioned in prior streams that I never had any formal training at any of my workplaces on GTD, but I did have an experience where a big corporation I worked for brought in a trainer to teach us how to have meetings. And a lot of the stuff is, kind of common sense, but it was really helpful to have this formal training. And one of the things that the trainer taught us was that as you're having your meeting, to be determining what actions need to be taken. He didn't use the term next action, but to determine the actions that need to happen and who was responsible for doing them and deadlines and who was going to keep track of this. And what was funny is when I was doing some temp work at some point later, and this running meetings had nothing to do with my temp job, but people saw the value of this, and then I was asked to run a series of meetings just because people noticed the value of determining actions and who was responsible and keeping track of it. So this is really powerful, especially if you have meetings with other people. So this simple question can really shift your energy, and I have noticed that this can help restart a stalled or tangled project and get it moving again. And sometimes I find that projects get like kind of, I use the word like tangled, like you can't figure out where to start because everything seems to have something in front of it. And when you keep asking, what's the next action? Well, what has to happen before that? And what has to happen before that? It can really help you get down to something that will get that project moving. Then there's a discussion of how once you get really entrenched with this thinking and it starts to become second nature to you, David Allen uses the word, it can seem nightmarish to deal with people that don't think this way. And that seems a little bit strong to me. I wouldn't use that word personally. I like to, when I'm talking to someone who doesn't use this terminology or this way of thinking, I like to just try and be helpful by sort of gently nudging them toward deciding what the next action is. And people are pretty receptive to this. Often, people just need a sounding board. They just need someone to ask them good questions and they can figure their own problems out. So in the next section, there's a comment or a discussion of how we are responsible for defining what, if anything, we commit to of all the things that come our way when we're dealing with ourselves and our own internal thinking and other people. And so I'm just going to be honest and say this is really hard for me. For a long time, it's been sort of my narrative that I have too much to do. And the only way I can get ahead or feel good about that workload is by just churning through it faster. And I'm trying to rethink that and take control of what's in my control. So then the final discussion of this, I love this little wordplay, is to make decisions when things show up versus when they blow up. It's a really fun statement. Like I said, I like the wordplay, but it's also really valuable because we had this in a prior chapter where you're going to do much better thinking if you do it when things are in your control and you have time, quiet, space. If you need your computer or other tools in front of you, you have them. Not to try and think when you have 10 urgent things coming at you at once. So I'm going to go ahead and check the chat, and then we will move into the next section. Okay, good. Everything's coming through. It looks fine. So going back to the chapter outline, we just covered the intro. Now we're going to get into the second of 3 sections, which is the source of the technique. The source of the next action technique we're talking about. So there's a really great quote at the beginning of this which reads, doing a straightforward, clear-cut task that has a beginning and an end balances out the complexity without end that often vexes the rest of my life. So I love this because I sometimes do this, like when I feel really overwhelmed with things to do. One of my instincts is to look for a quick win. Like, what do I know needs to be done and that will absolutely be a positive benefit? So I'll pick something that usually has to be done every day. Like if I haven't, tidied up my kitchen, I'll do that. If I need to brush the dogs, I'll do that. So something that is just a generic, always a win. And I find that getting that one of those quick wins can jumpstart the thinking and get me out of that kind of overwhelm and treadmill type thinking. So David Allen credits the origin of NextAction thinking to an executive coach named Dean Archison, who was using this technique before David Allen put it in his system in his books. He also describes thinking about the next action and making next action decisions is a learned technique. It's not something that we're born with. And I really like this because if it's a learned technique, that means you can learn it, and it also means you can train yourself to be better at it, which is really positive. Like there's nothing about this that would keep someone from doing it. You can learn it and you can learn to be better at it. And this kind of thinking comes automatically in a crisis. Like if you're in a true crisis situation, like say you're in a building that catches on fire, you don't stop to think what you should do. Your first instinct is to get the people out, get the people and the pets out, and everything else comes after that. It's automatic what comes in a crisis next. Then we get an exercise. So if you have a stalled project, see if you have a next action defined. A lot of times the project gets stalled because you haven't truly defined a next action. So it only takes a few seconds usually to just define a next action. So if that's the case for you, if you have something that's really stalled out, see if you have a next action defined, and if not, define one and see how your outlook on that project changes. One of the things we got in a prior chapter too is when you're making that next action decision to put it on a context list. So put it on one of your lists that are kept by context, because it helps you to really create a concrete next action, because you have to decide which list to put it on. So that's another way to get some help getting started with making a next action decision. So he gives this example of the executive who needs new tires on his car. And there's so much to gain from this. It's a really simple example. It's very mundane if you live in a city where you have a car, or a place where you have or need a car. And this executive knows that he needs new tires, and he's probably had something like tires written on his to-do list for months. The problem is that he had not defined a clear next action. Like that's not a clear next action. Like when you put tires, like are you going to a store? Do you need to set an appointment? Are you doing it online? Are they going to come to your house? Like what's the next thing you need to do? And when they got down to it, it was he needed some time, about 20 minutes in front of the computer to do some research. And he could have done that at any time in the last few months, but didn't have that thought out. So when he had 20 minutes and was in front of his computer, he didn't have that in front of him as a task to choose from. And when you do have a time block like that, you want to be able to pick from already defined tasks rather than trying to come up with them on the spot. And that's kind of the value of doing this thinking ahead of time. So even the simplest things can get stuck without a clear next action. And he gives us an example of a car tune-up. And it almost seems silly to throw the entire strength of the GTD system around something simple like getting your car tuned up. But when you think about it, we have so many open loops, so many projects, so many things to do. And this thing that is pretty simple can get just completely hung up because you haven't clearly defined what the next action is. And he goes through this whole example, and in the end, the person he's working with decides that he needs to talk to his friend to get the information on the garage to use, and that he can do that by email. So instead of getting hung up on it, he was able to take a step to email this friend and find out what the next action was. And so I guess the point is that even simple projects can get stuck, and it's not silly to throw the GTD system at something simple. So let me go ahead and check the chat before we move on to the next section. All right, very good. So I'm going to go back to the outline again. So we're in the second section, the source of the technique, and we're going to get into this discussion of why bright people procrastinate the most. So I really like this because I felt this discussion, and even the title of it, why bright people procrastinate the most, because it would seem counterintuitive. Like if someone's, smart and they seem to be together and all that stuff, like why do they procrastinate? So he starts this example with what I call the lemon exercise. And if you haven't ever done this, I don't want to spoil it for you, but go back and do it and, really let yourself experience it. But I guess I have to spoil it. The gist of it is that he walks you through this example of picturing a lemon and handling it. And when you get to the end, you're slicing the lemon and putting it in your mouth. And if you're like most people, you will have a response where your mouth waters. And I've done this exercise many times in many different settings, and it still works. It still happened as I was reading to prep for this stream. So your body and your brain process just the pictures you give them. And so the question is, like, point number 2, what pictures are you feeding your brain and how do they make you feel? And he gives the example of how do you feel when you picture having to do your taxes? And it's funny because this is a task that I dread so much. I mean, I dislike any kind of paperwork and administrative and bureaucratic stuff. Like, I really dislike that stuff, but taxes especially, I hate doing taxes. So it was funny to me that he picked that. And he mentions a lot of talking about people kind of awfulize it and figure out, well, what if I make a mistake and what if I get audited and I end up in jail or with a big fine or whatever. And that's actually not my worry. I've never had that kind of problem. It's just not something that's difficult for me. We use a software program. It's not too hard. I just find the act of doing it so unpleasant that I dread it. I dread sitting there for those few hours to do it. Point number 3, he mentions that sensitive, bright people can easily imagine nightmare scenarios. So it kind of ties into being, smart or creative, is that you have a good imagination and your brain can really imagine terrible things happening. So that might be why you procrastinate. If you're imagining terrible scenarios and you're really good at it, you might, end up procrastinating out of fear for that scenario happening. On the contrary, he says, who doesn't procrastinate? Well, people who just kind of plod into things without really thinking about all the things that could go wrong. And I heard this saying recently, so this is my contribution. Point 4A is turn off your brain and do it. And it really helps for certain things like that you might be dreading for not a good reason. Just stop thinking about it and do it. And then finally, he ends this section with the dangers of numbing down in unhelpful ways, such as having a drink, and it just temporarily dulls the negative images. But the problem is still there. So let me go ahead and check the chat, and we will jump into the next section. Okay, very good. So I'm going to go back to the outline. So we're now we're still in section 2, the source of the technique, but we're going to get into intelligent dumbing down. What a great idea. Or great concept, intelligent, like dumbing something down, but doing it intelligently. So point 1 is decide the single next action. So just one, define the next action. And nothing changes in your exterior world when you do that, but you'll almost certainly feel better. And we've done a few exercises earlier in the GTD book that kind of verify this. So if you haven't done those, and you're still reading, I would suggest when they come up, you actually do them. That this idea that nothing changes in your world, but you have a clear decision made about what to do about something. In point number 2, there's an exercise described where you go through all the stuff you captured earlier when we did the initial capture, and then decide on a single next action for every single one of them, and then see what happens to your energy. Like, how do you feel about those things that you have to do? And again, you'll probably feel a lot better about them, a lot more positive. So point number 3, he mentions that everything on your list, or everything you've captured or collected somewhere, is either going to attract you or repel you. And having a next action defined can make the difference. Thinking and decision making require energy and effort. And when you see all those things that don't have any next action, it reminds you of all the thinking you still need to do, and it feels overwhelming. And most people's reaction to their lists and their stuff is negative because they still need some thinking. And he gives, examples of a mixed to-do list that someone might have. So as an example, I would say you might have something like, pick up a suitcase that you had repaired, birthday gift for spouse, and family reunion on your to-do list. And those are all really different levels of things. Like, pick up a repaired suitcase is probably a next action. Like, if you took it to a shop, got it repaired, it's repaired, you just need to go over and pick it up. A birthday gift for your spouse needs some thinking. It needs some research, some decision making. A family reunion, planning that is a whole nother level of project. So each of these things requires a different level of thinking. Like, picking up the suitcase, it requires no thinking. The birthday gift requires some. The family reunion requires a lot of thinking and planning. Point number 4, he mentions one way that people slide away from GTD is by letting their lists become a mix of tasks and sub-projects or full-on projects, and not single next action. And that just makes your list kind of more stuff. It's like an amorphous bunch of things that are all different. Some of them are really big, some are small, some are thought out, some are not. And then again, he mentions this, the benefits of making your next action decisions as things show up before they blow up. Then the last discussion in this section is about, is doing all this defining of next actions creating extra work for you? And the answer is no, because you have to do it at some point, or you'll be forced to in a crisis, like in the car tune-up example, or was the tire example, I'm not sure. But if you just keep postponing making that next action decision, eventually your next action decision will be call for a tow because your car won't start. So you're not creating extra work, you just are doing it ahead of time. And it might feel like extra work. I know it does still for me, because I do a lot of that thinking, and it just seems like, why am I thinking so much and not doing anything? But with all of these things, you do have to do the next action thinking at some point. It's just whether you're doing it now or later. And we're only defining next actions on things we've actually committed to doing. So if it's on your someday maybe list, then you don't need to put a next action on it. So I want to be clear about that if you need to define a next action, it's something you've committed to doing. So that's it for this section. Let me go ahead and check the chat here. Good. Okay. So I'm going to go back to the outline. And we are heading into the final section of this chapter, which is the value of next action decision making as a standard. So when you can really make this the standard for decision making in your organization or with yourself. So hopefully by now you realize that there's a lot of value in this. I know it's been great for me. And then on this slide, he has some of the specific benefits you might experience. So one is clarity. You end all of your interactions without assumptions and with an understanding that if there is an action, next action, it's been defined and you know who's going to do it. And defining the next action also allows you to have a discussion of, is it worth it? And we've talked about that in earlier chapters when you decide whether you're going to do a project or a next action. It'll those decisions, those definitions of a project or an outcome or a next action, it lets you weigh it against the resources, the time, the people, the energy, the money that it costs to do that. So knowing those next actions allows you to make a good decision about, is this worth it? It helps with accountability. Everybody involved knows who's doing what. And it increases your productivity. This is from David Allen. He says that productivity increases when organizations do front-end decision making. Think about things before you have to. And I can totally see that. I think we all do much better thinking when we're not under the fire of a crisis. Like, when you have time and space and energy to think, you're going to do better thinking and make better decisions than when you're in crisis. So the final value he talks about is empowerment. So there was a whole lot of stuff on here, and I think this is really good because it's going to change the way this is about like changing the way people feel about themselves. So you have a greater ability to make things happen. Once you wrap your hands around the GTD system and implement it, you will increase your ability to define and complete projects. That might raise your self-esteem. It's going to give you more feelings of like winning and having just won, because instead of just churning through things, you're doing things that have a defined outcome that you have already decided are valuable and worth doing. So you're spending more of your time aligned with what you've decided is important and worth doing. It may help you not feel like a victim. Like when you can take more control of things, it may feel like you're not as subject to the whims of someone or something else. It also presupposes that there is something you can do, and I really like this, like the embedded assumption. If you say, what's the next action? The embedded assumption is that, well, there is an next action, and that there's something you can do about this. There's something you can do to move it forward, and that's a really positive assumption to have. May help cut down on complaining because people feel more empowered, and instead of complaining about something, they're asking the question of like, what's the next action? What's the next thing I can do to change this? Or what's the outcome that I want that I'm currently complaining about? It can help bring out the more positive elements of human nature, which I love. I think that's awesome. Like human nature can be really powerful and really good. And when we put structures in place to help bring that out, that's just a general win for everybody. And we kind of referenced this earlier, but you'll have a greater capacity to make things happen. When you make things happen, your confidence or your belief in yourself to make things happen grows, and then you can make more things happen. And then from an earlier chapter, we talked about how GTD gives you ground level control. You get control of that, low level, that ground level control. And then if your higher level direction changes, like if your life goals or your situation changes, you have the skill set to move yourself in that direction. So we are going to head into wrap up now. There we go. So if you have any final questions, comments, thoughts, you can add those now. And I want to say that one of my biggest takeaways from this chapter was the importance of not mixing things that I still need to think about and define an outcome or define a next action, and things that I have defined a next action on or defined an outcome. Well, not even an outcome. So things that still need thinking and things that I have already thought about on the same list or in the same place. Because you look at that and it doesn't feel like, oh, here's a list of actions I could do right now. And I have definitely, when he talked about how GTD, you can slip by mixing those things, I've definitely done that. So as I'm going through and doing this reread, I am kind of cleaning up all my uh, lists and files and things so that they have really hard edges on them. So we're in the final stretch of this live stream series. We have 3 chapters left in the book, and I will cover one in each of the 3 remaining live streams, and I expect to wrap up in September. The next stream will cover chapter 13. I don't have it scheduled yet, but make sure you're subscribed so you get notified, and you can always check my community tab. That's where I usually post it once it's scheduled, among other places, but that's usually where it's posted. So let me go ahead and check the chat. Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you so much for being here live with me or on the replay. This deep dive into GTD has really been a pleasure. I have really enjoyed going through it with you, and I've gotten a lot out of you. Some of you have left really insightful comments, which I've appreciated. So be sure to hit the like button on your way out, and be sure to subscribe so you get notified of future GTD streams as well as other related content. Thank you so much, and have a great day. Bye.